Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in the novel by Samar Reine, First Sons and Last Daughters. We're going to take a look at 222 to 237. It is a transitional part of the novel. We're going to transition into a very important phase in the life of Peyton Chase. Let's go to block 1 and get started. Restoration work and or existential work. They both run together on parallel paths. The work of restoration. Peyton's client was a person of uncompromising standards. Her grandson had damaged the fine art Peyton was called on to restore, and the client called it having to bear the burden of a child. Peyton can identify with that with her own son. The double meanings leap off the page for the reader by the language used by the author in this section. The client recognizes an existential link between herself and Peyton and motions for her to sit down next to her. There is an existential connection. Peyton interjects, "You know, nobody is problem-free, are they?" The client responds, "You sound just like your mother, Harlow." And she adds, "I loved your mother. I was very surprised that she chose to marry an intellectual." Then the client added this compliment, "You are choice, just like your mother." What a compliment to receive. Tremendous. The discovery of one of Harlow's early paintings. The client confesses to owning an early painting by Harlow. It's the painting of a woman reading old love letters. Painting of a woman reading old love letters. She gives Peyton permission to examine it and to photograph it. She offers to sell it, possibly at a later date, for the upcoming museum that Peyton wants to open. This entire dialogue is very powerful, has an extreme existential meaning to it. Very, very powerful. Let's go on to block 2 and see where we go from here. Okay, we know that atonement is two-sided. It does also include participation. A self-righteousness can become a stumbling block that sometimes a person cannot see. Mrs. Valesco, the client, offers, when she's looking at that and hearing the story that Peyton's going through, she goes, "Your husband's pride is killing his pride." Or to say, "Your husband's pride is killing his self-image." We cannot be a hero to our grown children when we really want to keep them grounded. Then Mrs. Valesco surprises Peyton with an additional commission for a personal painting by Peyton, and it's to be displayed in her very well-known mansion in Carmel. So she knows Peyton has a mansion in Carmel, but she also has a well-known, famous mansion, and she wants an original painting by Peyton to be displayed in that Carmel mansion. If we move on to existential restoration and its many climbs. The mansion of Atalia is a masterpiece of architecture and wonder. Peyton recognized it as a thoughtful architectural design. Now, Peyton needs thoughtful self-architectural design. She needs that kind of work in her own life right now. Can you see how Reine brings us back and forth into the existential? Mrs. Valesco wants Peyton to tour the mansion and then decide what the original work was going to be for display in the home, and it will be alongside the very best of fine art that Mrs. Valesco has acquired over the years. Peyton interprets this request as an opportunity to take on the role of self as existential bridge. It's a bridge to reclaiming her genuine, true self. So she looks at it that way. It's going to be the self as existential bridge. The client tells Peyton that this project must extend from her spirit, not simply from the intellect. Peyton closes out the visit with this statement: I will return the restoration as good as new. And again, this whole section is running two parallel lines. You've got the historical narrative, and then you've got the existential narrative. Let's go on to block 3, the renovated architectural self, working on a new self-design. Mrs. Valesco tells Peyton that the first step would be to desensitize the self from her child's choices. She says, let their choices stand on their own. Second, you need a reunion of bonding with your husband, because obviously that intimate bond is currently lacking. Now we move on to working through dialogue with a strong mediator. Peyton meets with Hector Strongman, Ashton's recommended art detective. He tells Peyton he's already located 5 of her mother's original paintings. Peyton tells the investigator that she will trust him. She will take that necessary leap of faith. The reinvigorated architectural self can only be gained through struggle and suffering, through cross-bearing. Peyton is to meet Gideon at the highest restaurant in LA. It's 71 stories up. And she calls it an architectural statue on stilts. Again, we're emphasizing the metaphor of architecture. But Gideon, rather than showing up alone, Gideon has brought Ashton with him. Ashton greets Peyton with affection. Gideon remains seated and rude. Another test of restoration arises. Adler arrives surprisingly at Gideon's request, of course. He's trying to cause chaos. Peyton thanks Ashton for locating the art investigator, and she says she asks him to please stay because he improves things. Adler arrives with Bryce and goes directly into a fit of anger, bolts from the scene with Peyton in pursuit. Peyton explains that this was all Gideon's doing, but Adler demands that Peyton should have immediately exited out of that situation when she saw that Ashton was there. Peyton tries to console Bryce, who is breaking down due to the family conflict, but Adler again interjects his, we are not okay. He's just angry, and he's going to make sure that he makes his anger known. So the question is, where has the author brought us? Where has Reine brought us? She has, Peyton has been commissioned to paint an original work of art for Mrs. Valesco's mansion that will be toured by visitors, tourists, because it is and will continue to be filled with fine art marvels. She's been invited to reframe the self in an original way. She has agreed to trust a mediator for her future eschatological goals. She has received the saving help from Ashton's intercession of atonement, and by desensitizing as best she can, she will pass through cross-bearing. She will pass through suffering. So I see all kinds of existential import in this lesson, and it's very, very obvious all the way through the entire lesson. You've got block 1, we're looking at restoration work as really the need for Peyton to do existential work. Then we have the theme of architecture being, the metaphor of architecture being brought up throughout this entire section of the novel. The Mrs. Valesco scene, the Mrs. Valesco encounter, is very, very existentially powerful. And getting the advice from Mrs. Valesco and finding someone who actually can identify with what she's going through is a tremendous help. And she has one of her mother's original early fine art works. And then we have the commission. This lesson is all about the new commission. Mrs. Valesco requires a new spiritual, do you catch that? A new spiritual original work of art from Peyton. She's been commissioned to reframe, re-identify, repaint her identity in a new, original, life-defining way. And then this is all kind of crystallized in a architecture on high. In other words, representing existential transcendence. It all kind of crystallizes on the 71st story of this architectural statue on high. The metaphors in this are tremendously powerful. They are leaning into artwork, of course, but also leaning into architecture, and it's very, very powerful. And then everything closed out with renovating the reinvigorated architectural self. And that's where we're going. Peyton is now on a genuine task to reinvigorate, to be born again and be reinvigorated as a reinvigorated new architectural designed self. And just to wrap up, we're going to read Block 3, Note 5. Where has Reine, the author, brought us? Peyton has been commissioned to paint an original work of art for Mrs. Valesco's mansion that will be toured by tourists and will be filled with fine art marbles. She's been commissioned to paint an original fine art work. She's been invited to reframe the self in an original way. She has agreed to trust a mediator for her future eschatological goals. She has received help from Ashton as an intercession of atonement, and she realizes, though she will desensitize it as much as possible, she must take up cross-bearing. She must pass through suffering. But it's all about beginning with existential work and closing out with the reinvigorated architectural self. That's going to wrap up 222 to 237. We will pick up again in our next lesson.